Hello and welcome to the 7th session of the Tokyo International University Global Dialogue, China and the Western Balkans, What the Future Holds. I'll be your moderator tonight, and my name is Chris Lamont, and I'm an associate professor here at Tokyo International University. We are delighted to welcome everyone this evening here in Tokyo and this morning over in Europe to our session, in which we have a special guest who is joining us from Albania, Mr. Ralf Gjoni. Mr. Gjoni is a member of the Albanian Parliament from the Independent Parliamentary Group, and he is currently serving as the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also serves as a member of the European Integration Committee. His international experience stems from 2 decades of government positions, public relations, strategic communications, government relations, and in the nonprofit sector. He has worked for a variety of companies and organizations in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and most recently, Albania. Before entering Parliament, Mr. Gjoni was the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the Speaker of the Albanian Parliament from 2013 to 2017. And prior to that, he served as spokesperson and General Director of Communications at the Albanian Ministry for Foreign Affairs from 2009 to 2012. On the international arena, Mr. Gjoni has worked extensively with top-level parliamentary and government officials in London across Westminster and Whitehall, in Brussels across EU institutions, and in Washington, D.C., as well as with a variety of political and economic and media representatives across Asia and North Africa. Mr. Gjoni's research interests are particularly focused on the future of transatlantic relations and the future global role of China in Europe. In 2015, he represented Albania at the second China, Central and Eastern Europe Young Political Leaders Forum, which took place in Beijing alongside other political representatives from Central and Southeast Europe. Our discussant for this evening is my colleague, Professor Medlir Mema, an associate professor in international relations here at Tokyo International University. Medlir holds a PhD in political science from the George Washington University and wrote his dissertation on the role of civil society in drafting the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. Over the last few years, his research and teaching interests have taken him to Kosovo, Albania, North Macedonia, and Greece, where he has spent a considerable amount of time with politicians, victims, and international actors discussing the impact of violence on local communities and the best way to ensure sustainable peace through sustainable development and transitional justice. Now, before I hand over the floor to Ralf, I would like to remind our audience that we are live and on the record tonight as this session is being recorded, and also that we welcome questions from the audience, which you'll have the opportunity to ask during the question and answer session following Professor Mema's discussant remarks. Please either write your question in the question and answer box or use the raise hand function and let us know your name and affiliation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ralf. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Lamont, and thanks a lot to the Tokyo International University for the very kind invitation. I feel very honored to be invited by your prestigious institution. Thank you very much to Mr. Mema as well for helping to organize the event and also to agreeing to discuss. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can for such a huge topic of interest, not only for today, but also for what the future holds, taking into account recent geopolitical developments across the European continent, the United States, and the very patient, slow, progressive empowerment of China and its presence and its alliances with various countries across the world, but notably in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. Just a little bit of a brief history, because I think it is good to put it in context. Following the fall of the Iron Curtain 31 years ago, countries across Central and Eastern Europe have come a long way from their dark communist days. Geographically, these countries are stretched from the Baltic Sea across to the Adriatic coastline, the coast of the Black Sea, down to the Mediterranean Sea. Huge. Most of them are now NATO members. Most of them are EU members. All, even those who are not EU members, are aspiring for EU membership. Therefore, geopolitically and strategically, the region has changed a lot since 1990-91. Of the entire bloc, though, a very small pocket of handful of countries in the Balkan Peninsula are yet to be fully integrated into the EU club. This pocket, situated at the heart of the European continent, has in recent years been rebranded by EU officials, not necessarily approved by officials in the region, as the Western Balkans. And it continues, in my view, continues to be a battleground where interests of major geopolitical players have clashed. I know it sounds great, grand, as if the Western Balkans was the clashing grounds of the global powers, but it is true, and it is a fact, that interests of global powers have clashed across the region. The European Union, the United States, Russia, Turkey, China, and even Iran have all been active across the region in order to increase their presence and influence. Briefly, the EU developed a policy to support the gradual integration of the Western Balkan countries within the Union. In 2013, Croatia became the first of the 7 countries to join, and then Montenegro, Serbia, the Republic of North Macedonia, and Albania now are official candidates, with accession negotiations and chapters having been opened with both Montenegro and Serbia, while Bosnia and Herzegovina and possibly Kosovo are potential candidate countries. The United States has maintained a policy of support for the accession of these countries into the EU and has led efforts to seal off the Adriatic coastline inside NATO's borders. With the recent memberships of Montenegro and North Macedonia, only Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina remain outside of NATO, with Serbia not wishing to join anytime soon, although it seeks to become a member of the European Union. Russia, thanks to Serbia, continues to be very present, using its traditional links and alliance with Serbia, its tentacles in Republika Srpska, which is a little pocket within Bosnia and Herzegovina, predominantly populated by Serbs. It's been present in Montenegro and in North Macedonia in the recent administrations before the Zaev administration took over in Skopje. Russia continues to maintain a presence and heighten interest to strengthen ties with all of these countries, including Albania, in order to counter EU and US influence and weaken NATO's sphere across the region. Turkey is another big player. Under President Erdogan's leadership, Turkey has sought to increase its presence and investments across the region, arguing that Muslim populations in the Balkans are proof of the natural brotherly ties between Ankara and these countries. In fact, Erdogan sees the Balkans as a natural part of its, let's call it neo-Ottoman aspirations and sphere of influence, especially so in Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Albania. I mentioned Iran because of the recent diplomatic activity and threats to Albania specifically following the relocation of more than 3,000 members of the People's Mujahedin organization of Iran, what we call MEK, the Mujahedin al-Khalq, from their camps in Iraq to Albania, heavily supported as an action by the United States. This has posed a lot of problems for Albanian politicians with Iran and certain threats, direct threats from Ayatollah of Iran towards Albania. But over the past decade, one country has become the most prominent third actor in the Western Balkans, with activities spread across sectors such as economic investments, culture, media, and political institutional relationships. And that country is China. It is now evident that China has worked patiently over the past years to expand its presence across the region while engaging and strengthening ties with an increasing number of local actors. The strategy is not unique to the Western Balkans, but to the whole Central and Eastern Europe, which since 2012 has been embedded into what we call China's 17+1 cooperation initiative, which is a platform specifically designed to promote the wider strategic Chinese Belt and Road Initiative along the ancient Silk Road path, seeking to enhance cooperation across Asia and Europe in the fields of infrastructure, transportation, logistics, trade and investment, expanding ties in the areas of culture, education and tourism and media. As the process of EU enlargement has stalled towards the Western Balkans, the process of China's investment into the region has increased and accelerated. Some of the major investments include, to mention, Serbia's highway project, the E763 project, the Budapest-Belgrade railway project, the China-Europe Land-Sea Express line. In Croatia, a major bridge called the Pelzej Bridge is signed by a Chinese consortium led by the China Road and Bridge Corporation. It's a major strategic bridge because it is designed to provide a fixed link from Southeast Croatia to the rest of the country, bypassing Bosnia's small coast, which cuts Croatia in half. So they're basically building a highway on the sea to link the two parts of Croatia. In Poland, the acquisitions of the Huta Stalowa Wola civil engineering machinery division. In Montenegro, a Chinese firm is constructing a major infrastructure project with which links the capital of Podgorica with the country's most popular ski resort of Kolašin, and then goes beyond towards Serbia. In Albania, where I'm based, the only international airport of Tirana was acquired in 2016 by China Everbright Limited from a German consortium, and its partner Friedman Pacific Asset Management Limited. The investment was declared as part of the corporate strategy to identify good infrastructure investment opportunities in line with China's Belt and Road Initiative. The concession value was not made public, but it is speculated to be at around 83 million euros, constituting one of the two major Chinese investments in Albania, next to the other major oil extraction concession of Bankers Petroleum, a former US and Canadian investment sold to a Chinese company called Geopolitical Petroleum in 2016 for around 425 million US dollars. Bankers continues to produce the majority of Albania's crude oil, amounting up to 95% of its crude oil capacity. Overall, trade volume between China and the 17 Central Eastern European countries has reached or has passed the 100 billion US dollars mark in 2020. That's huge. The trade figure represented a year-on-year growth of 8.4%, higher than the growth rates of China's foreign trade and the country's trade with Europe last year. Such trade levels seem to have raised concern, though, in Washington, and the United States seems to have embarked upon an aggressive campaign to consolidate ranks among Central and Eastern European countries, aiming the weakening of the 17+1 initiative and with the withdrawal of Chinese investments across the region. This has been very notable in Montenegro, Macedonia, but most recently in Albania and also in Romania. In October 2020, last year, former US President Trump sent a letter to Albania's Prime Minister Edi Rama, praising him, and I quote, for Albania's leadership in the region and throughout Europe in exposing China's malign influence, human rights abuses, and predatory leading practices. These are not my views. This is the letter from former President Trump to the Albanian Prime Minister. Trump's letter was in reference to Albania signing the Clean Network Pledge, an initiative by the US State Department which aims to address long-term threats to data privacy, security, and human rights allegedly posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Notably, the network excludes members from utilizing any 5G services from, I quote again, untrusted IT vendors, including Huawei and ZTE. The 5G clean path is described as an end-to-end communication path that doesn't use any transmission, control, computing, or storage equipment from any of these companies. Trump also told Rama that Albania He hopes Albania and the US can soon sign a memorandum of understanding of 5G security that paves the way for others in the Balkans to do the same. Serbia signed the pledge also, but it then opened the Huawei Innovations and Development Center in Belgrade just days later. The government of Serbia is also working on a project called Safe City that will see thousands of smart surveillance cameras distributed throughout the capital. They have facial and object recognition capabilities, which is interesting to note. However, though, despite efforts by the US to engage in a counteroffensive, China has been working patiently and progressively over the past decade in order to acquire real leverage over policy choices, political attitudes, narratives in some parts of the Western Balkans. While it has not defined this endeavor as following an explicit strategy, Beijing has implemented policies designed to establish a significant presence along key land and maritime routes that run deep into Europe. However, the US counteroffensive seems to have produced some initial visible results most recently. It is not yet clear, in my view, how effective its efforts to dismantle the 17+1 initiative will be, especially as the European Union is suffering from major divergences, union fatigue, and a loss of appetite for further enlargement. These are all key components to be taken into account when analyzing the strength of US leverage and engagement in the region, which depends heavily on the EU integration of these countries. It is worth noting, though, that the last 17+1 meeting was boycotted by 6 countries, with Romania leading the way in showing that China is beginning to have a problem in Eastern Europe. In addition to saying no to sending its president to the summit back in February, Romania has booted Chinese companies out of core sectors like nuclear power and telecoms. Other countries like Montenegro have also recently expressed concerns about the quality of Chinese investments. And of course, the Albanian Prime Minister has also pledged its faithfulness and loyalty to the NATO strategic alliance and to the wider transatlantic alliance, which includes EU countries and the United States. But despite this, China has been consistent in forging numerous relationships with individuals and institutions across the Central and Eastern European countries, boosting ties in key areas of infrastructure, energy, culture, media, and party politics. And I say this because I've experienced this myself back in 2015, in the early days, I would say, of the 17+1 initiative, when I was very pleased, to be honest, to have been invited by the Chinese Communist Party, the international department, to participate at the second China and Central Eastern European countries' Young Political Leaders Forum in Beijing. A fascinating forum, very interesting, very enjoyable from the cultural point of view, cultural exploration of China. I mean, it is a pleasure to visit Beijing, I must admit that. But very interesting from a geopolitical point of view and in seeing how China is investing in catering to forging personal relationships with young political leaders across these countries, and how it aims to strengthen political ties between the Chinese Communist Party and political parties across these countries, notably parties that are in power. In 2015, I need to highlight that Albania was a candidate country for EU membership. And the country was identified as a potential candidate in 2003. That's 18 years ago. In 2 years, there will be 2 decades that Albania awaits the integration into the European, we call it the European family, but I think it's better to refer to it as a European club. Since then, the process of accession has been extremely slow, and not only for Albania. It's been disappointing, pejorative, confusing, and very, very tiring for all of us, like myself, who have been involved in its internal mechanisms and negotiations with the European Union from early days. For the past 6 years since Albania gained candidate country status, despite a series of positive recommendations by the European Commission, which for those who don't understand probably is the executive branch of the European Union, EU member countries have been reluctant to open official negotiations with both Albania and North Macedonia. While the decision has been formally taken, the first intergovernmental conference, which opens de facto in practice the negotiations, is yet to take place with no date in sight, despite numerous promises. This has resulted in a general overall fatigue across the Balkans, which after the difficult year of the coronavirus pandemic, which no one knows how long it's going to last, will amplify and increase tensions between these countries and the European Union. Signs are already visible with leaders of Albania, Serbia expressing dissatisfaction with the strategy of the European Union to manage the vaccine distribution against the coronavirus, with the Balkans or the Western Balkans being left out of any early stages of the European distribution. And as this EU integration enlargement has stalled, Beijing has been very smart in exploiting geopolitical inconsistencies of many Western capitals, grasping the opportunities to invest in strategically important sectors, or seeking to invest at least, that arise from the persistent development gap between the Western Balkans and the EU, as well as the region's lack of sustained political and economic convergence with the European bloc. However, though, the difference between China and the EU, which I think is very important to note, is that Beijing does not interfere in internal matters and does not seek to democratize these countries. And this is a key component which is currently conditioning the EU integration process of these countries. Now, you can imagine that elites, political elites in the Balkans and across Central and Eastern Europe, even some EU members, suffer from high levels of endemic corruption and autocratic tendencies, which have allowed other non-transatlantic actors to capitalize on forging political affinities with such autocratic political leaderships. And these are turning increasingly, these leaders in these such countries are turning increasingly transactional in their mindset, in how they handle their international relations, as their dreams of European integration fade, or for those EU members like Hungary or the Czech Republic or Poland, as their EU membership suffers from broken ties, value-based ties and cultural ties with other Western, more traditional founding fathers and members of the European Union. Tensions have been raised most recently as countries across the Western Balkans have been understandably angry and frustrated at the lack of vaccine, as I said, shots from the EU. In Central Europe, this has prompted very recently members like Hungary and the Czech Republic and others aspiring countries like Serbia to buy millions of doses of China's Sinopharm COVID vaccine. Recently, President of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, went to the border with North Macedonia to donate several hundred doses of vaccines to Macedonian Prime Minister Zoran Zaev, and quoted in English that a friend in need is a friend indeed. And it is very evident and very clear that the pandemic has exposed rifts in old alliances and is opening up opportunities for the forging of new alliances based on mutual interests, mutual values, but also help and assistance in difficult days. And as the EU has stalled in helping the Balkans with vaccines, of course, countries like China and Russia have been very quick in jumping in providing these countries with extremely cheap doses of vaccines, which, according to latest data, show to have produced some efficacy in combating the virus. And the concern of many Europhiles or advocates of the transatlantic alliance like myself is that the EU enlargement, which is continuing to vegetate at the moment, if it continues to vegetate and stall without concrete and visible results in the short term, away from empty rhetoric, away from tick the box approaches that the Brussels has taken over the past years, this will create a huge gap between our countries and Brussels, and will leave space for the consolidation of a gradual political ecosystem which is built on shared values between non-EU actors and autocratic leaderships across Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. To illustrate, and this is very recent, yesterday I was invited to speak at the presentation of the latest National Security Barometer in Albania, which is an annual barometer poll organized and supported by a German foundation called Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And this barometer, for the first time, very interestingly, showed the percentage of respondents who think that China had a positive influence on the country's security has increased by 31% when compared to 2019. There is also a very high increased percentage of about 17% points of those who think that China has a very positive influence and a significant decline of those who think that China has a negative influence compared to only a year and a half ago. We're talking about Albania, probably the most pro-American country in the Balkans, probably the most pro-European country in terms of national support for the EU integration, taking into account that Albania was the most isolated dictatorship of the former communist bloc, much more closed than former Yugoslavia or other Eastern European countries. Now, amid the increasing security-related tensions between the USA and China, and the connection that Albanian citizens naturally see between their country's security and the United States and NATO, this latest result of the security barometer calls for a thorough examination and analysis by security experts and those who are interested to see what the future of the European Union holds and where the future of the transatlantic alliance lies. In my view, the next decade will prove challenging, very, very challenging for the Biden administration and for the consecutive administrations in Washington. I believe that the Biden administration will be more engaged with the Balkans, given the past involvement of the Democrats with Kosovo's independence, a very pro-Albanian stance in the Clinton administration, Obama's engagement with the region and also countering China's offensive across Europe. And I believe that Biden will continue on Obama's footsteps and will be more aggressive against China's expansion. But this will put our countries in a very difficult position. While we're faced with constant EU nagging about democratic standards, fighting corruption, which are all great and extremely necessary homework duties for our countries. However, the political elites, autocratic political elites in these countries will use the slowing down of EU integration in order to increase pressure against the EU by forging relationships, even if publicly they pretend to be countering China, they will continue to play and forge relationships with Beijing as Beijing throws more money across the region. And I believe that this friction and tension between Washington and Beijing will produce NATO's next challenge over the next decades, not just over the next 10 years. If after the 90s, I remember as a graduate as a student in the United Kingdom, and even later in the 2000s, we were talking about how NATO is seeking to define the future of its existence and how it's seeking to find a purpose. Well, I believe that NATO's future purpose will be to serve the transatlantic family and alliance in countering probably and handling the indisputable role that China is progressively, patiently showing that it has in the world. And given data and numbers and how China is projected to act economically as a power, as a superpower in the future, I think this will present the major challenge of NATO and the United States. And I think that I would like to close it here. I believe that I've given an expose or of an overall picture of how China has been very smart in exploiting the deficiencies of the process of EU integration, and how this is increasingly seen with a lot of concern from Washington, and how this will forge the next phase of NATO's existence and the European Union and US involvement in Europe in countering China. Thank you very much. And I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much for that, Ralf. Before we open the floor for questions, we'll hand over the floor to Professor Mema, who will provide a few discussant remarks. In the meantime, though, if you think of questions or you'd like to ask a question, feel free to write it in the question and answer box. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ralf, for that wonderful overview of the current situation and all the issues, I think, with regards to the Western Balkans and China. I think there was a lot there, and I hope that people paid attention to, I think, a lot of the nuances that you introduced in the discussion. What I want to do, because I do want, I think, this, and I want the audience to also engage with you in questions and answer. What I want to do is perhaps, I'll touch on a few of the things that you have already discussed, but I want to organize them along 5 different points. I'll just kind of go down 5 main points and then turn this over to the Q&A. And in some ways, this reflects some of the issues and I think the concerns and some of the arguments that you presented. In other ways, perhaps it pushes us to think a little bit beyond that. So the purpose of what I'm about to do, and I think some of this results from a long-running conversation I've had with Professor Lamont, with Chris here over the last month or two, as we have kind of engaged over this issue of China, and especially regards to the Balkans. Of course, Chris has his own connection with Croatia and the region, and mine are obvious too. I want to acknowledge, by the way, also some of the participants here, good colleagues of mine and friends of mine from the Western Balkans. And so I'm happy to see you here and to see you participate. Let me then kind of go really quickly to these 5 main points that I want to make for today's discussion. I think a couple of them may also be a little bit controversial, if you will, and not necessarily from the perspective of, let's say, Albania, right, or the countries of the region, but also thinking from the perspective of just the global competition between China and the United States, or the West and China. So let me start first by acknowledging, I think, or the need for all of us to acknowledge a reality that this increased Chinese influence in the region is here to stay. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether Chinese investment in the region is going down or not. And I think there's an acknowledgement that perhaps the influence in terms of sheer investment projects outside of Serbia, right, in the region are not quite as large, I think, as they're made to believe. And I think that Ralf did a very good job of pointing that out, that perhaps maybe some of this, hype about Chinese investment in the region maybe is a little bit, it's probably a victim of its own thing. But it is, I think, by most counts, that the Chinese investment and Chinese influence in the region perhaps has made China the 3rd most prominent actor, right, in the Western Balkans. And that taking into account also Turkey and Russia, on which I'll just mention quickly. But over the last decade, by most counts, again, Chinese investment, FDI, so foreign direct investment in the Western Balkans, in the 6 countries there, without mentioning Kosovo as well. It's about $2.4 billion. And then you got about $7 billion in infrastructure loan commitments. Okay, so it's about $10 billion investment over the last 10 years. Now, again, there are different numbers, but that's a good roundabout number. What makes this approach by China, and I don't think China is unique in this, but that China has used this kind of wide-ranging effort, right, in terms of economic investment, to also make itself indispensable as a political actor. We are far from that happening, but that is in some respects kind of what some suspect the Chinese purpose here and the investment, the goal behind the investment is. I will push against that in a second because I don't think that's necessarily the case. But inevitably, I think it goes without saying that if you can make yourself economically indispensable, that comes and that will translate in political influence as well, even though they may not necessarily be right for the immediate purposes what the Chinese are trying to do. The other thing that I want to say, so one is acknowledging the reality of Chinese investment. So the question is not, will China stay or go? I think the question is how should the region engage with it, and then how should the West engage with China, acknowledging the reality of Chinese investment in the region. The second one, I think it's important for us to understand the EU and US complicity, maybe that's a little bit too strong of a word, responsibility, I think, for the current state of affairs. That both the US and the European Union are both responsible because of their disengagement, reneging on promises, and I think Ralf can point that out very, very clearly. The lack of support, I think, and we can go back to the Trump administration's influence and their policy in the region. The lack of support for liberal elements of civil society and also of political forces. I'm most familiar here, obviously, with Albania, but we can, if we look back at what's happened over the last few years across the region, whether it's in North Macedonia, Montenegro, right? You had almost a soft coup there. In Kosovo, you had the Trump administration being complicit in the fall of the Kuti government last year, and of course we have now EU's mishandling of the COVID, which have made the EU and the United States as very unreliable partners. Now, we are far from saying the region is turning their back towards away from EU and United States, but I think that United States and European need to have a good hard look at themselves for the reason why some of these countries in the region are looking elsewhere for alternatives. And again, some of this has to do with this, especially with regards to EU membership, and Ralf, I think, mentioned that very clearly. The third thing that we need to, I think the third point I'd like to make is that perhaps as we think about how do we deal with this new China factor in the region, is that we should recognize the zero-sum nature of the interactions between China, Turkey, and Russia. And I say that because when the Chinese are pushing into these regions, it doesn't mean that this is coming always at the cost of the Americans or the Europeans, but this is also come at the cost of Russian and Turkish influence in the region. This is important to recognize because it can be instrumentalized. The United States and the West made this mistake throughout the Cold War, thinking of this the Eastern Bloc as a monolith, right? And then it took kind of like a Nixon and a Kissinger to think of that. Wait a second, maybe the Eastern Bloc is not quite the monolith that we think it is. We can perhaps play them against each other. We need to recognize that between the three actors I mentioned, Russia, Turkey, and China, perhaps China is the one that comes with the least amount of baggage, right, in the region. All three of them are led by autocratic regime. Arguably, you could argue also that corruption follows suit there. But of all three of them, right, if you had to choose the worst evil of the three actors there, of all three of them, perhaps China presents the least difficult choice, considering China's lack of linguistic, cultural, ethnic, right, political, and even historical ties. Now, of course, we could talk about Albania's ties with China briefly through the 60s and 70s, but that's really just a blip in the history. China doesn't really have a long-standing relationship with Albania. Serbia, of course, stand a little bit outside of that, partly because of the, I think, of more recent history, and that is especially China's support for Serbia's argument against Kosovar independence. Of course, you'll remember that NATO bombed, if I'm not mistaken, Kosovo's the Chinese embassy in Belgrade as well. And so there are those feelings of, so to speak, anti-Western sentiment that most of the Serbian people, more so than the Serbian government, I think, has displayed. But given that, I would argue that of the three, perhaps if you had to choose between Russian and Turkish and Chinese influence in the region, perhaps I would go with the Chinese influence. We should also be more careful, and here I agree with Jacob Mardell, a recent report that he actually published for the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany, that the Belt and Road Initiative, right, that we've been hearing so much in terms of these investments, in his view, and I see it the same way, is less of a concrete route from A to B, and I'm quoting his findings here, and more of a foreign policy concept that, in fact, it's a very abstract, that describes abstract policy goals, including, but not limited to, growing overseas markets, occupying and developing the capacity of Chinese companies, and of course, deepening Beijing's economic leverage abroad. And I think I want to emphasize this economic aspect here because we do jump right away into political and security dimensions. Now, of course, influence is a fungible asset, meaning that it can be influence, right? Economic influence can be repurposed in the future. And I suspect there are many within the Chinese, government that see it as such. But I personally don't think that we should help to turn this into a self-fulfilling prophecy. That we can perhaps design policies to limit Chinese influence strictly within the economic sphere, and perhaps co-opt that to push out of the Balkans. I would argue perhaps even more dangerous Turkish and Russian influence. The fourth thing that I want to mention, and I think Ralf commented on this a little bit, but I want to expand on this point, and that is that we should not underestimate the region's penchant for pursuing short-term self-serving alliances and adopting a pragmatic rather than ideological kind of alliances. All right, so there is, at least in my view, and conversations I've had with people in the region, very little indication that countries in the region are rushing into China's arms because of some ideological affinity. Okay, and I think that's an important point to make here. Instead, we should see these closer relations with China as an attempt, I think, on one hand, to drive a harder bargain, right, with the West. So that's one reason for that. Famously or infamously, you had in March, actually, of last year, in response to the COVID pandemic, when the Serbian President, Aleksandar Vučić, criticized the EU and its members for not doing enough to support Serbia. And then in response, right, the Chinese offered to provide some funding. And then in response to that, right, the EU and the Americans provided, aid, 5 times the amount of what the Chinese had promised. So there is this very instrumental and pragmatic approach to pitting, right, the West against China, with a hope that the West will come through. Okay. There is also another element, so another reason for, I think, turning their eyes towards China here, the pragmatic turn towards China. It is, of course, the no questions asked, right, approach to the Chinese economic investment in the region, which, of course, on one hand, helps regional leaders, autocratic leaders, to deliver on their electoral promises while also lining their pockets. And we've seen this throughout the region. It's not just unique to Chinese investments, but because China does not ask questions, unlike let's say Western investment in the region, then these autocratic leaders, especially in Serbia, of course, in Albania as well, with the Rama administration, which by most accounts has been engaged in very corrupt PPPs, right? So private-public partnerships. They see this as an easy way to finance some of the projects that they have not been able to do. So, like I said, Serbia is an outlier, I think, in the region. Perhaps a little more deeply engaged with China than the rest of the countries. But we can expect and suspect that in the future, other countries can come can come in. Finally, I want to also argue that the current status quo is untenable from the host country or the Western or even the Chinese perspective. What do I mean by that? The region cannot continue to support corrupt autocratic leaders, right? We've had some cleaning done in Kosovo most recently, I think in North Macedonia, although some would contest that, but relative to the previous administration. In Montenegro, we had a new government that came in. But when we look at what's happened in Albania, you look in Serbia, there's a lot of work there to do to clean up corrupt autocratic governments and corrupt and autocratic practices. The problem is that, we can't keep going like this. This has to stop at some point, or else it's going to cause more and more problems for the West, as we have seen with huge migration flows from these countries to Western Europe. Even from the West, this is not sustainable anymore. Ralf made a point of saying, look, the West is interested in democratic practices. We can't continue to nourish and strengthen and to continue to financially, in a way, support the current structural kind of political and economic interests, whether it's in Albania or in Serbia or in Bosnia or other countries as well. But even from the Chinese perspective, I don't think this is sustainable anymore, right? It's been clear. The Financial Times actually came out with a very important, I think, and critical report back in December 2020, when they were arguing that actually the wheels were falling off of the Belt and Road Initiative, meaning that because by the nature of the investment in China and the country that China is targeting to invest in, right, corrupt, inefficient, both bureaucracies as well as economies, the return on investment is not being what the Chinese thought it was going to be. And so China itself is interested in a better return on investment. And so what I'd like to argue is that if we look at then from the host country perspective, the Western perspective, Chinese perspective, I think it's time for the West and the Chinese. I don't think this isn't an issue for the countries. These countries are too small to actually change the conversation. But it's time for the West and the Chinese to come together and perhaps, I would like to propose, and this would be controversial, perhaps use the Balkans as a proving ground for building bridges between the West and Chinese. Much of the rhetoric, even with the Biden administration, is all about confrontation and not cooperation. I'd like to argue that the Western Balkans may provide a testing ground for cooperation, where the Chinese are invited to invest and the West insists on democratic and reforms. This would provide a stable ground across the region, would provide for a better return on investment for the Chinese, and who knows, would provide for perhaps a better conversation and a success story between the West and the Chinese. So I'll stop with that, and then I'll let the audience ask questions.
Thank you so much for that, Medlir and Ralf. You've certainly both given us a whole lot to think about and to discuss tonight. And we have questions in the Q&A chat, and we also have a hand raised in the audience. And I see, I guess we'll start there with Professor Hak-Yen Lee. So Professor Lee, can you ask your question?
Hello, thanks, Mr. Ralf Gjoni. Thanks for your talk. It's very interesting. I have two quick questions here. The first one is about the European perspective and also the, let's say, Western Balkans perspective regarding China's foreign policy. Because when you refer to those Belt and Road Initiative or maybe the vaccines diplomacy from China, it seems like the Chinese government emphasizes a lot about the norms. They talk about every norms such as non-interference, community of common destiny, women cooperation here. So my question actually would be something like, when those Europeans, or let's say Eastern Europeans, or let's say the Balkans people, when they receive those norms from China, are they really believing in those norms? So my questions would be something more specific, like whether China has successfully presented what they want to those people in Europe and also in the Balkans. So this is my first question. And my second question actually would be, because right now there will be a lot of studies regarding the public diplomacy in China, it seems like there will be different kinds of setbacks for the Chinese public diplomacy because we have the gap between those elites in the government and also those ordinary people. They do not have the same will or the same thought with the government, let's say, with the elites in the government. So do we have the same gap between the elite people in the government in Balkans, and actually they do not share the same thoughts with those people, let's say other people in the Balkans? So that would be my second question here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hakin Lee. Chris, could I ask for your help, because it was cut on a couple of occasions to clarify the questions. The first one, as I understand, is does China represent a success story to these countries? Is that correct?
In terms of this, yeah.
In terms of
public diplomacy, I think, Professor Lee. Yeah.
Sorry, can I repeat again?
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, can you please? Yes, because you were cut on a couple of occasions and it distorted the meaning. Please.
Sorry, probably because of my internet access here. So let me repeat. My first question is that the Chinese government always emphasize on non-interference, win-win cooperation, and community of common destiny. So those principles and norms sounds very attractive to those people in Europe, in Balkans. But whether this is true, so let's say whether the government in the Balkans, in the EU, or maybe in Eastern Europe, whether they truly believe in those norms and also principles. So this is my first question here. And my second question is that some studies reveal that there will be a gap between those people in the government and those ordinary people. So let's say the elites in the government or the government officers, maybe they are very appealing to the Chinese norms, but those people, ordinary people, they have no feeling regarding the Chinese, rhetorical statement of policy. So do you find the same gap regarding the case in the Balkans or maybe more generally Eastern European continent here? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Yes. I mean, do these countries share the same norms of non-interference with the Chinese leadership? Yes, in many ways. I mean, these countries are not necessarily interested, especially in Southeast and Central Europe, are not interested to interfere in, let's put it this way, in the political conflicts in Asia, especially where China is directly affected. I mean, Albania, for example, has a one China policy, quite clear. And Albania has stayed away from getting involved with Taiwan or with the Hong Kong issue, for example. Although it's been under, as far as I'm aware, not only Albania, but several of its NATO members and EU candidate countries have been under constant pressure in recent weeks and months to toughen up their stance on China regarding allegations of human rights abuses. It's worth noting here that Albania had a bit of a conflict with China several years ago because it decided to host or grant political asylum to 4 former Uyghur fighters. So that caused a little bit of a friction between Tirana and Beijing. But that brings me to the second question. I mean, is there, you said that, autocratic leaders and political elites are very happy with this kind of norms, but is there a gap between the people, what the people aspire and what the leadership wants, if I understand well? Yes, there is a gap. First of all, the majority of these, the populations of these countries are very clearly oriented towards European integration and a very pro-American stance. It is natural, it is a strategic choice, not politically, but also culturally of these countries. They feel very much part of Europe. And despite the frustration coming from EU member states, these countries and the people in these countries remain firmly oriented towards the West. Having said that, as difficult times unfold, and they see that the European Union is more absent in helping, and Chinese investment and a helping hand is more and more felt and visible across the region, that is creating I would say, the necessary breeding ground for a change or a shift in the feelings of these populations. The latest barometer in Albania is a clear illustration of that. And also, let us not forget the very historical traditional ties between countries like Albania and China. I mean, when Albania broke off its relationship with the Soviet Union in the 60s, the only major ally was China. But before China was recognized at the United Nations, Albania was the only country in the 40s to represent, I mean, one of the smallest countries in the world. It's a fascinating story. It was officially lobbying and representing China's People's Republic at the United Nations. I mean, that's an amazing story. People of my age and older still have memories in China of Albanian movies from the communist era that were being broadcast on Chinese TV. Some of them older than 50 or 60 still remember old Albanian songs from Albanian films, which is, again, absurd, fascinating, and amazing for a lot of the Albanian people. So there is something that China is used to build upon in forging alliances. The same with Serbia and its relationship with former Yugoslavia. So I believe that, yes, there is a shift, or there is the space for a shift in popular feelings towards China. And I think that the US has sensed this, and they have become aware of this in recent years. And that is probably why the United States has been more active in recent months in countering China's influence across the region. That's the only way I can explain that. And I believe that it will define the relationship between Washington and Beijing over this region. And I mean not the Balkans, but I mean the entire Southeast, Central, Eastern European space as a battleground between the West and China. And sorry, Medlir, Mr. Mema, it's a great suggestion that you have made, that probably the Balkans could turn into a testing ground in forging a new love relationship between China and the United States. But I remain very skeptical. I don't see that coming anytime soon. And I actually see that our countries will be stuck in this friction that will only amplify over the next few years between the two mega powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Professor Lee. I see we have another question from another colleague, our dean here of international relations at Tokyo International University, Professor Akitoshi Miyashita. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Gjoni, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. It's a great honor to have you here at the TIU Global Dialogue. My question is about the relationship between EU and China. You mentioned that the EU has been very, very slow in responding Albania's and other countries in the region's request for joining EU. EU has also been very, very hesitant to provide the vaccines for COVID-19. And you seem to suggest that this EU response or slow responsiveness led China to take advantage and try to expand its economic and possibly political influence in the region. Do you think that if EU decides to let Albania and other countries in the region to join EU for political reasons of stopping China's influence, do you think that would affect Chinese foreign policy toward the Balkan states? Do you think, for example, that China would slow down its economic relations investment, or do you think that the Balkan countries joining EU does not affect Chinese economic and possibly political activities in the Balkans? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Professor Akitoshi. Excellent question. No, that's the short answer. I don't think so. And let me explain why. China is already present, and even more present across Western Europe than it is in Southeast Europe. Huge mega investments, both in France and in Germany, the two major controlling powers of the European Union. And we all are aware of the recent investment in 5G in the UK, although we know how that went after US pressure over London. But in any case, I don't see China's interest fading in seeking to expand. Whatever the decision by the European Union is, whether it is political or technical, to allow these countries to become members one day, which I don't see it for another 10, 15 years, probably, with the way things are going at the moment. But even if it was done in the next 5 years, I don't see that that would discourage China from seeking to expand and further its presence and also its ties with these countries. I don't think China is bothered by the EU integration of these countries. Of course, at the moment, it's probably easier in many ways to deal in each of these countries in terms of regulation and technical requirements. And once Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro become members of the EU, yes, it'll be a bit harder in terms of what criteria they have to fulfill for investments. But no, I don't think that it would slow down the strategic foreign policy expansive interests of China towards the region. But taking into consideration your question, I'd just like to highlight something that I think I touched upon during my discussion, but I think it's pretty crucial in how we define the relationship between Brussels or EU member states and the Western Balkans. From the name Western Balkans, when I was a little bit younger, we were not the Western Balkans, we were the Balkans. Slowly, we became the Western Balkans. And now the Western Balkans has taken a very derogatory, negative meaning. So when people say Western Balkans in France or Germany or Brussels, they mean a space of high levels of corruption, organized crime, murders, etc. Which is, of course, partly true, although countries in the Western Balkans are safer in terms of security than a lot of EU member states, in terms of security on the day-to-day lives of their ordinary citizens. But it has taken a derogatory meaning, and that is very frustrating for a lot of us. Now, look at how China brands the region. China brands the region as CEEC, Central Eastern European countries, one space. Look at how Russia refers to the region for many, many years. Southeast Europe, they never talk about the Balkans or Western Balkans or Southern Balkans or Albanian Balkans. And I think that is a very deliberate, smart, strategic choice on how they brand the region. And I felt that myself in the numerous meetings that I've held over the past, I've been active in Albanian politics since 2009. So over the past 12 years, every time I go to Brussels, it's been very difficult to argue our case with our European counterparts. And I've noticed over the past decade how the number of members of the European Parliament that has decreased in how in defending and in advocating for the Western Balkans interests and aspirations in the European Parliament. There is less members of the European Parliament taking an interest into the Western Balkans. And every time that we are in meetings with our European counterparts, we feel like we're all guilty of the high levels of corruption and links and ties to organized crime that our politicians represent. And that's not the case. I mean, I myself, I hold dual citizenship, so I have the luxury to see this from both sides of the coin. I'm a French citizen, and I vote in French elections and European elections as a French citizen. But I'm also an Albanian citizen, so I felt both sides of the story. But it is very pejorative, and I think the EU should take note of this, and should take this criticism from people like myself as a constructive criticism and as a cry for help to change its strategy. I mean, the EU has to make up its mind. Does it want enlargement or it doesn't want enlargement? And the EU has to be honest. And enlargement does not mean just empty rhetorical narratives and tick the box reports that are almost copy-paste from year to year. They do not work anymore. Our populations are extremely frustrated, and they don't believe these fairy tale dreams that are depicted and painted across TV channels now that, wow, you're doing great, substantial progress is being made. Albania, North Macedonia are very close, but just a little bit more. And every year there is a new condition that is invented to just further stall their EU integration process. And I believe that if the EU does not change the approach radically and quickly, and does not pay attention to this part of the world, I think that will only work in the favor of countries like China or even Russia in the future.
I think Medlir also has a comment on this question.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I think it's a very important question, and maybe one aspect I did not include in my comments, but that also is the reason why I was saying that we need to recognize that China is here to stay. I agree with Ralf 100% on this issue, but let me also add that one of the incentives for Chinese investments in the area, considering how small, again, the market is, right? Again, the investment is significant for the market, but it's not necessarily, right, commensurate when it comes to the size of the Chinese economy. So why do it? And one of the reasons they're interested in doing that is because obviously they anticipate that sooner or later these countries will enter the European Union. And therefore having this investment, having a beachhead over now, of course, remember it's a 17+1 dialogue, right? So there's other countries that are coming into this, but if they can build bridges, if they can, I mean, in a figurative way, but literally, I guess, as well, then they are also able to have staying power long term. And a comment that I did, and I recognize the difficulty of my recommendation, Ralf, that, you know, and that's why I'm going to try and make a recommendation wherever I can and whenever I can, because Chris and I, again, we've talked about this, and we recognize it's difficult. And perhaps nobody's in the mood for that kind of positive talk between the Americans and the Chinese, but it's absolutely necessary. And the stakes are quite low in a way for both countries in some way, if you think from the US and Chinese perspective, that it's worth it, right? Because, you know, if you fail, then what do you got to lose? If you win, then that's great. It's a win-win kind of thing. And so the Chinese are interested eventually for these countries to enter the European Union, and they cannot enter in the current state, corrupt autocratic leaders, right? And therefore they may be persuaded, right? They may be open to being convinced to say, hey, you continue with the investments, whatever it is you're doing, as long as that stays within the sphere, the economic sphere, and you let us, meaning the EU, do the rest of the right liberal political reforms. This removes that economic burden off the Europeans, and to some degree even of the Americans. And we know the Europeans are even more willing than the Americans to compromise because they just signed a big deal, right? A huge agreement with the Chinese not too long ago. So certainly the Europeans are not beyond these kinds of, you know, agreements and negotiations on this. So I think there is room there. I think for some workaround and to do some finding common ground between the two of them. Also, Chris, if I may, for a second, I want to recognize we actually have with us today also joined us the ambassador of Albania to Japan, Mr. TIUGD. So I'd like to recognize him and welcome him to this. And of course, I think maybe I speak on behalf of all of us that if he has something to add to this, we welcome his comments if he'd like to say something. So I'll turn the time over to you, Chris. Anyway, sorry.
Thank you so much for that, and welcome, Ambassador Teneshito, to the Tokyo International University Global Dialogue. I think, Medlir, your comment brings us to the first question from the Q&A chat box, and that's from Garon Kamberi, who asks whether or not the relationship between China and the Western Balkans could develop into one that is win-win, whereby these countries are able to balance their geopolitical interests with their economic interactions with China.
Yeah, I think I gave my answer to that, but rather, since I've spoken on that issue, I'd rather have Ralf, I think, his take on it.
Great. Ralf.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. No, I don't think so. I don't think that it can be developed into a win-win situation, because I think that our countries do not only need economic investment. Our people also strive for democratic rights, and overall we share the same values that have been crucial in building Western democracies, such as the British, French, German, and of course the American democracies. And as our systems are clearly oriented in being built to resemble those of the Western democracies, I think that it'll be very difficult to develop a win-win situation with China. Of course, I think that we will have excellent ties with China, without any doubt. Culturally, there will be lots of links between the two countries. But I think that the US action over the next few years, which I only foresee to be accelerating and getting more and more aggressive, will counter China's investments in the region. To give you, again, this is not necessarily a US achievement. It's not actually even seen as a major achievement in Albania, but it's a signal. The airport of, the international airport of Albania that was acquired by a Chinese consortium in 2016 has just been negotiated to be sold to an Albanian-owned consortium. So already China is losing one of its major investments in the country. And also I know as a fact that several tentatives or attempts to acquire strategic investments in the field of energy, hydropower energy, have not been successful by the Chinese government due to, of course, Western and US, specifically US pressure. So I think that it'll be a relationship under growing strain from the West, and it's going to be challenging in my view.
Thank you so much for that. That brings us to our next question by Clarita Sadiraj, who asks or raises concerns rather about Chinese investments and kind of reliance on workers that are who are brought in from China. And her concern is that whether or not increased Chinese investments might put downward pressure on working standards and human rights in countries in the Western Balkans where there are extensive investments, and whether or not Chinese investment needs regulation, more regulation.
I mean, yes, there is some concern about that. I mean, there has been shared concerns across countries about the quality of Chinese investments and Chinese work. Notably, Montenegro, for example, has been very concerned about the return of the Chinese investment and also the pace of development of the project of building this major highway and infrastructure bridge that links the capital with a ski resort area. Also workers' rights as well. Yes, there is some concerns about that. but it's not as if these countries are flooded with Western European and American investments that we would be able to compare the rights of workers. But I think that I don't personally see that as a major concern over the future, because despite the slowing down of EU integration, I think that this is a process which will go ahead, despite reservations from countries like France and other members. I'm referring to France as the most recent blockage of Albania's and North Macedonia's negotiation or accession talks blocked 2 years ago by President Macron. But France has since changed that approach, and it seems to me that following the pandemic, the EU integration will accelerate. And that means the strengthening of human rights and democratic credentials of these countries. I mean, to take, although I'm a bit skeptical in many ways, because I know the process quite well, but I remain hopeful that the justice reform, the milestone justice reform that Albania has embarked upon since 2014, despite difficulties, will eventually start to bear some fruits in fighting corruption and ties to organized crime. And that will bring Albania or countries like Albania and North Macedonia a step closer to European values. It's a long process, but yes, I agree with Ardita and with Clarita, I'm sorry, that is a very, very good question. And yes, there is some concern about the quality of Chinese investments, which needs to be addressed, yes.
Thank you so much for that question and response. Our next question moves us to Kosovo. And Luis Giraldi asks whether or not China's increased investments in the Balkans might give Beijing more leverage and influence in the Balkans, specifically in relation to negotiations between Serbia and Albania over Kosovo.
No. Beijing has stayed out of the Kosovo issue. They do not recognize Kosovo for obvious reasons. They have a very clear policy of not interfering this, dealing with Kosovo as an internal matter of Serbia. And until Serbia makes a step towards the recognition of Kosovo, I do not see Beijing taking a leading role in negotiations. The European Union has maintained that role to some degree unsuccessful, because talks have not produced much between Belgrade and Pristina. And I see that the Americans will be more involved in trying to unlock the current deadlock between the two countries. But I do not see China playing that card. No, I don't.
Right. And the next question is one that I think, Ralf, you've already kind of answered, and it's from Miko, who asks whether or not there will be a potential investment battle within the Balkans between the West and China. But you seemed to suggest earlier that it wasn't as if there was, countervailing.
I mean, okay, to be pragmatic and with both feet on the ground, as we say in Albania, the Western Balkans, it's a small population, small area of the world. It's not the center of the world in terms of investments. I think we should see the Balkans more as part of the wider Central Eastern European space, which it's almost half of Europe in terms of number of countries and population as well. So it'll be a battleground geopolitically. Investments, we're yet to see a lot more in Western investments in these countries, which, if I may highlight, if I have 1 minute on that one, very often Western investments, especially American investments, are conditioned on the rule of law and democratic practices in our countries. But I think that efforts should be made that as the building of the consolidation of rule of law and the building of justice systems, proper justice systems in these countries will take time and will take several years. I think that there needs to be a geostrategic political decision to encourage a little bit more presence of Western investments in these countries, because in the end of the day, investments are not just economic investments. As we are seeing, everything is geopolitical, and everything has to do with foreign policy and political clashes at the global arena.
Thank you. And our final question of the evening comes from a colleague, a professor of international security here at Tokyo International University, Professor Orr Honing, who asks about, or would like to know a little bit more about, the geopolitical orientation of Albania towards the Middle East. It's a little
interesting.
scope of the.
No, it's not. No, it's actually not. No, it's quite linked. The latest poll that I was referring to, the Barometer of national security, also showed an increased tendency to view countries, Arab countries in the Middle East, as more positive than 2019. So while perceptions towards Russia and Iran have worsened, perceptions towards China and the Middle East have improved. China notably improved. There is no geopolitical orientation of Albania towards the Middle East. That has to remain clear, because if you take even countries that began the Arab Spring, like Tunisia, even Arab countries in the Maghreb region are not geopolitically oriented towards the Middle East, although culturally they're tied to the Middle East. Their values and their aspirations to build democracy, and I'm referring specifically to Tunisia, are clearly oriented towards the West. And so if that's true in Tunisia, it's tenfold more true in countries like Albania that are European at the core. I mean, we are Europeans as a nation. And having said that, I mean, yes, there is some concerns about attempts by some Middle Eastern countries, but also some Turkish elements to sponsor and foster and encourage a little bit more religious investments in the region, notably building mosques and religious foundations. But I still see it difficult for it to become a problem for Albania, viewing how Albania benefits from a largely secular and relative harmony between its three religions, notably the Muslim religion, the Catholics and the Orthodox, and also the small Protestant population in the country. Most of Albanians are clearly liberal, non-religious, and quite open to European values. And I don't see that there is a geopolitical orientation towards the Middle East. No.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Professor Honing, for the question. I guess if we have time, maybe we have time for one last question from the audience, and that relates to Albania's relations with Japan. And kind of what is the state of them, and potentially could Japan be some form of a counterweight to China? And this is a question from Luis Giraldi.
Great, that's a fantastic question, and I wanted to touch upon that during my discussion at the beginning, but I didn't want to mix. I wanted to hold the conversation more on a global arena without wanting to put Japan in the China discussion, taking into account the past history between the two countries. Yes, we are very, very, very interested to see an increase of Japanese investments in Albania, and there has been a lot of help from Japan. I've been involved in the early negotiations to try and convince the Japanese Foreign Ministry to open an embassy, referring back to the days of 2009, 10, 11, 12. And finally, 2 or 3 years ago, Japan has now opened its own embassy and has its own ambassador in Tirana. And we're very, very happy and very glad about this decision taken by the Japanese foreign ministry, because I think that it gives more meaning to our bilateral ties. We would like more investment from Japan. I know that there has been a little bit of a problem with a project that was funded by JICA to fund the water sewage systems in the capital, Tirana, a project which has been marked by slowdowns and also the failure of the firm that was contracted at the beginning to deliver concrete results. And as far as I know, I'm not sure if the firm was Albanian or Italian who won the tender, but that has been a little bit of a difficult point in our relationship because it has slowed down further investments from Japan. But I do think that there is ground and there is a desire from Albania to see more Japanese presence and Japanese investments, not only in the country, but also across the region, taking into account the Albanian-speaking populations across our neighbors in Montenegro, in Kosovo especially, and in North Macedonia. Yes, it would be welcomed to see more Japanese presence in here. Whether that is the intention of Japan, that remains for the officials of the Japanese government to answer. For example, I can mention that one of our points that we have requested, as far as I'm aware, is the liberalization of the visa regime for Albanian citizens, because I believe that that will increase. We need to increase human contacts between our two countries. And I think that that could be a gesture from Japan that would be beneficial for increasing contacts. But yes, we are very honored and we're very happy to have seen a general improvement of relations and of ties between the two countries. And I'm personally very, very happy that after so many years of trying to convince the Japanese, they managed to agree to fund the opening of the embassy in Tirana. So yes, very good question. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. And it looks like we're coming up on an hour and a half. So that will unfortunately have to be the last question for our discussion this evening. Before we conclude, I would like to thank our speaker, Ralf Gjoni, for joining us tonight and for his very insightful presentation. Also, I'd like to thank Medlir Mema for his discussant remarks. And I would like to thank the audience as well for turning up, and also for a kind of very stimulating and great question and answer session. So Ralf.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say thank you specifically to you and Medlir and to the Tokyo International University for this wonderful forum of discussion, and to all the participants, to the professors of your university, and more specifically to the Albanian ambassador for taking the time to participate at our discussion. So thank you very much, and I look forward to future discussions with your global forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that note, you can find out more about our future events on Facebook and Twitter. So if you follow us at TIU at International Relations on Facebook and Twitter, you can keep updated with our future events. So thank you all so much to everyone for attending, and good night from Tokyo.